Welcome to Storytime. Today, we found out what happens when entitled teachers meet Pro Revenge Masterminds. In high school, 10 plus years ago, I was quiet and attentive in class. Teachers liked me. I wasn't popular, but I had good friends. I say all this to explain that high school was relatively calm for me. I played sports, was on the student newspaper, and got decent grades. However, that all changed my second semester junior year. I've always been a voracious reader. My freshman English teacher recommended I move up to the honors English track, so I did for freshman, sophomore, and the first half of junior year. Then I was put into classical literature my second semester junior year. I've always loved Greek and Roman stories, and always read your typical high school classical reading list on my own. I didn't mind reading them again until I met Miss Umbridge. She put on a sweet facade, but she was downright evil. She also decided she hated me. I still don't know why or what transgression I committed, but she hated me. I assume it was my habit of sometimes nodding off in classes. At the time, I had undiagnosed thyroid issues and was getting up at 5 a.m. for swim practice. I say sometimes because it happened maybe twice a month total between all 8 classes. I don't remember nodding off in her class, but it could have happened. Anyway, her class was 50% essays, written reports. The rest were random quizzes and a couple tests. I was on the student newspaper, and I was a decent writer. I wasn't worried about maintaining a B or up. We wrote our first paper, and I got a D. I was shocked. The only class I struggled in was chemistry, and still my lowest assignment grade was a C. After class, I asked Miss Umbridge what I did wrong, because her notes were minimal. She told me my assessment of the material was uninspired. Okay, can you direct me to an example of an inspired assessment? Come back during study hall. Thinking she'd have some example materials for me to review, I got a pass to see her during study hall. Nope, she spent the full hour basically telling me I was an idiot. I remember leaving and crying because she didn't tell me anything constructive. My friend, the eventual valedictorian, offered to help me on my next paper. My friend and I spent hours on my next paper. She never got below an A- on anything. I got another D. My friend was furious. She took it to her AP English teacher and asked him to review it. She said she was entering a writing competition and wanted advice. He said it was great, her typical A+ work. My friend, quicker on the uptake, asked me for a copy of my original assignment. She asked her AP English teacher to look it over too, and he said she should enter the first one. This one was still good. He'd probably give it an A-, but the other paper was better. My friend was convinced Miss Umbridge was treating me unfairly for some reason and she must not like me. My friend wanted to tell my parents or my school counselor. A teacher didn't like me? That had never happened. Sure, they all didn't love me, but none had actively disliked me. I decided I'd try one more time, but this time get Miss Umbridge to help me. Despite the previous horrors of spending study hall with Miss Umbridge, I went to her office during study hall 3 times before the next paper was due. She reviewed the paper and gave me tips on revising it each time. She did this in red pen. I took notes. By the time the next paper was due, I had 3 revised versions with her notes in red ink on each one. I got a D+. She smirked and congratulated me on my improvement. Bitch. I was done. My friend was right. This bitch had it out for me and was giving me shit grades on purpose. I'm a laid-back person, but I was pissed. Never before been this pissed. I took my paper to my newspaper teacher. Sure, he didn't teach English, but our student paper constantly won awards because of his work. I told him I was having trouble in English, and could he please look over my paper and give me advice. He was a little confused as to why I didn't ask my English teacher, but he did it. He also told me it was great, but gave me a few minor changes to make. I asked him if he thought it was a B or better. He said he'd give it an A. Not 100%, but a solid A. I went to my friend and we brainstormed. I couldn't request a drop/add. This wasn't college. You just don't switch classes at my high school unless the teacher recommends an honor placement. That's not true, said my friend. The football and basketball guys get moved to easier classes all the time to keep their grades up, so they are eligible for games. The athletics director was a friend of my dad, so I requested a meeting with him and my swim coach after school one day. I told him I was in danger of losing my eligibility to swim because I was pulling a D in a class. I wanted to move classes, but I knew I'd need approval from administration, which I wouldn't get without a good reason. They asked if I had requested help. I explained I had asked for help from multiple people, but my grade wasn't improving. I didn't know what to do. They asked to see my papers. I sat while they read them. They both looked at me confused. Neither of them could understand how these papers were worth only a D. The student VP was brought in. He asked who helped me. I explained my friend, who knew who she was, again, future valedictorian, and she had even asked her AP English teacher to look it over for advice. I had also asked my newspaper teacher to help me. Student VP asked if I had ever actually asked my teacher for help. I smiled and handed him the 3 revised versions of paper number 3 with Miss Umbridge's red ink all over them. He frowned. AP English teacher and my newspaper teacher were pulled into the meeting. They were each asked to grade the papers. All 3 papers got an A- or better. While this was going on, my dad was called in by the athletics director. My dad was pissed. He demanded I be moved to another class and that Miss Umbridge be put under review. Clearly, she wasn't grading students on their work, but on her own personal opinions. The school administration obviously bristled at the accusation that a teacher was treating students unfairly. A lot of arguing that I wasn't allowed to sit on occurred in the VP's office. I could hear plenty of yelling as 6 adult men argued over the appropriate next steps. It was decided that myself, my dad, VP, and athletics director would have a meeting with Miss Umbridge. The following morning before school, we all met. Miss Umbridge seemed to think she was going to tell everyone why I was so stupid. VP explained that if I maintained a D in her class, I would lose my extracurricular eligibility, and we were all meeting to discuss what to do. She smirked and said I should be moved to the non-honors English track, and I had no business being in honors English. I didn't have the aptitude to understand the complex classical literature they were studying, and I probably would need a tutor to even get through basic English. I've never seen my father so red, and I half expected to see steam coming out of his ears. VP asked why she didn't try to help me improve. She said it was up to students to put in the initiative to get better. VP asked if that meant I had never asked her for help. She said I had not. VP then pulled out the 3 revised versions of paper number 3 and handed them to Miss Umbridge. Now it was her turn to be read. She called me a liar and said those notes weren't hers. Things got heated, and I was asked to leave again. I sat outside the office. This time the secretary was there, and we both heard the shouting. School was set to start in 30 minutes, and they were all just shouting. Then AP English teacher and newspaper teacher were called in again. More shouting. About 5 minutes to the start of classes, the teachers left, and I was called back in. If looks could kill, I'd have died then and there when Miss Umbridge walked out of VP's office. I was being moved to basic English effective immediately. My current grade would not carry over. I would not need to make up any past assignments, and new teacher would be instructed to grade me only on the assignments going forward. My new English teacher, Miss Honey, ended up being the English department head. She was at least 65 and had been doing this for decades. After 2.5 years of honors English, this class was easier than PE. I barely had to try to get an A. But I refused to let Miss Honey think Miss Umbridge had been right. I tried harder in that class than any other class that semester. I finished projects so quickly that I was asked to tutor a girl struggling in the class. I spent half the class period just helping this girl understand the material. I helped her go from a C- to a B+. I got something like 104% in the class. At the end of the semester, Miss Honey called me into her office during study hall. She was recommending I return to honors English for senior year. I must have looked panicked, because she assured me Miss Umbridge would not be my teacher. In fact, she would not be anyone's teacher. She was leaving at the end of the school year. Miss Umbridge was only in her late 20s and unmarried, too early to retire. And my high school was in one of the best-paying school districts in the state. I knew what leaving meant, but Miss Honey still explained that I was put in her class on purpose. The school administration trusted Miss Honey to determine the truth of Miss Umbridge's claim that I was basically a lying idiot. Miss Honey stated I very clearly belonged in honors English. She apologized if her class had not been challenging enough for me. I cried. I mean full-on ugly snot cried. I didn't realize it, but part of me had actually believed Miss Umbridge up until that moment. Miss Honey hugged me and consoled me. I spent senior year in honors English and spent my study hall tutoring Miss Honey's struggling students. To this day, I think about that awful woman fairly regularly. My career is strongly writing-based, and I still worry obsessively over my writing. I hope she never taught again, because she wreaked havoc on my self-confidence. Wow, I can't believe that awful woman did that to him. I'm happy he got his sweet revenge. In the late 90s, wife and I were just married, just getting started, and we decided to dink, double income, no kids it for a few years to save up for a down payment on a house. The dot-com bubble was still rising, and I was a newly minted software developer. I had an entry-level job for a while and then got recruited to a new city and a new job that paid 3 times what I was making before. It was an offer too good to pass up. I ran the numbers and it was a no-brainer. By living frugally and saving my entire salary, living off just her income, we would easily have enough in a year to put 20% down payment on a new house. We rented an apartment in a new city that was listed for $950 a month. The landlord was a real estate agent who owned a 2-bedroom condo as an investment property. Let's call him Hank Wazowski. Hank was a thin, gray, no-nonsense guy. He was pleasant enough, but perfunctory, dry, and had no sense of humor. He made a point of explaining that under no circumstances was he responsible for maintaining the garbage disposal and that it was not included in the rental agreement, and he would not be responsible for fixing it were it to break. Okay. He seemed slightly amused by us, a clueless young newlywed couple, but I could tell he wanted to rent to us because we were very obviously a safe choice as renters. We filled out the rental agreement and the credit check, and this is where my troubles began. Hank looked hard at the credit application where I listed my job title, software developer, and my income, $75K. For a 23-year-old in his second year out of college in the late 1990s, this is a small fortune. Throw in my wife's salary, and we were over 6 figures in income, renting an apartment far beneath our means. Like I said, dink is the way to go when starting out. I can't believe how much money you make, Hank must have said half a dozen times, muttering under his breath. I explained we were saving to buy a house and that we were only going to stay in the apartment a year. We might stay a few months after the term is over. Would month to month be okay after a year? Hank assured us that would be fine. We saw Hank only once during the year, and he again mentioned my salary and how he couldn't believe that's what software developers were making. It was awkward and I gave a vague reply. Anyway, a year later, we had found a house to buy, signed all the papers, and were making plans to move. The new house wasn't going to be ready until 2 months after our rental lease was up, so I called Hank to ask if we could, as discussed, simply extend the lease by 2 months before moving out. Hank assured me on the phone it would be no problem and he would send over an extension for us to sign. The extension arrived in the mail, and it included a month-to-month clause and a $500 increase in the rent. I flipped out and called him. Hank, why are you increasing the rent over 50%? That's too much. That's more than my new mortgage is gonna be. He was super condescending to me. Rocky Moose, it's what the apartment goes for now. I would be losing money by renting it for less. I tried to reason with him, but it was very clear he knew we could afford the $500, had no choice in the matter, and he was going to screw us over as best as he could. He got angry with me for arguing my point, and I'll never forget his parting words. You don't have to like it, Rocky Moose. You just have to pay it. My wife and I tried to figure out a way to move out early by putting our furniture in storage for a couple of months and crashing with friends, but it just wasn't gonna work out. I swallowed my pride and wrote out the check for $1,450 for the extra month. A month later, I wrote a similar check, and then we moved out. I made sure the apartment was spotless before moving, but still Hank withheld $300 from our security deposit for bullshit things that were just a way for him to squeeze a few more dollars from the kids who made too much money. $100 for cleaning, sure, but $300 was obscene. In my mind, he had screwed me over for $1,200 and there was nothing I could do about it. What made it even more infuriating is that I saw the ad Hank put in the paper after he moved out, and he listed the apartment for rent at only $150 more than we had been paying originally, not the grossly inflated $500 increase, and it didn't rent. A month later, I saw the same ad, and he had lowered the price to $75 more than we had been paying, and I assume it got rented since the ad stopped appearing. Fast forward about 5 years. Life is good, the house is good, we have a baby, and even though the dot-com bubble has burst, I'm still employed. One day, out of the blue, I overhear one of my coworkers, Phil, a senior developer, talking to the guy working the reception desk. Hey, Mike, I'm expecting someone to drop off some paperwork for me. If a Hank Wazowski asks for me, tell him I'll be right out. I freeze and get a taste of bile in my mouth, remembering how I had to write out that name on those checks all those years ago. There's no way it's the same guy, right? I walk over to Phil, who was still by the reception desk. Phil, I say, how do you know that name, Hank Wazowski? Phil explains that Hank is his real estate agent. I bought my condo through him several years ago. I'm selling my condo now so I can buy a house. So I'm gonna ask him to be my agent again. Do you know him? I tell Phil that I used to rent an apartment from Hank and described what he looked like. Phil confirms the description. It's the same guy. Wow, small world, right? And on cue, right then the front door to the office opens and in walks Hank Wazowski. I stare in disbelief. He's carrying a folder of papers and doesn't recognize me. Phil and Hank shake hands and they talk for a few moments. I stand there silently, wondering what to do. Phil finally says, "Hank, this is my friend Rocky Moose. I think you may have already met?" "Yes, hello Hank, good to see you again. My wife and I were your tenants a few years ago on whatever street. Remember the software developer who rented for a year saving to buy a house? Well, this is where I work. Here, with Phil." Hank's eyes indicate he now remembers me, and he's starting to put it all together. We shake hands and he says yes, of course he remembers, and asks how we are doing. "Oh, we're just fine, thanks for asking." Phil says that you're his real estate agent. Small world, isn't it? Hank nods pleasantly. He still doesn't remember the details of our last conversation. I do some quick math in my head. This is the early to mid-2000s. The real estate market is very strong and easy money for any agent. The crash of 2008 is still a few years in the future. I start to think out loud. Selling the condo for around $150,000 to $200,000 and you're looking at houses in the $500,000 range, so that's $650,000 to $700,000 in total transactions. An agent getting 3% on the sale and the purchase is getting around $20,000 for his trouble. That's a good commission for the agent, isn't it? Hank's eyes flash, and I can tell he remembers everything about me now. Phil is surprised at my passive-aggressive tone. I'm enjoying the uncomfortable silence. Hank deflects my question, saying it's complicated, and tells Phil to send back the papers as soon as possible. He shakes hands with Phil, looks at me, nods, and goes to leave. "It was really good to see you again, Hank," I call behind him. He exits the building. As the door is still shutting, I say a bit too loudly so that Hank can hear, "Phil, don't sign anything just yet. I have a story to tell you." Phil looks at me and says, "Rocky, what the hell was that all about?" He looks pissed and confused about my behavior. I tell Phil the whole story. The rent, the $500 increase, the security deposit. You don't have to like it, you just have to pay it. Everything. "Phil, you can't use this guy to sell your condo and buy a house. I hate him. He's evil. I'll help you find another real estate agent. Just use anyone but Hank." So the great thing about Phil is that, well, he's a great guy. He says he's a little surprised at my story and has always known Hank as a straightforward guy. "But I totally see him doing that to you," he admits. "There's no way I could use him now. What a dick." Then Phil's eyes light up a bit. "What do you want me to say when I fire him?" I have special feelings for Phil now. We came up with a plan and I made sure that there were some key phrases in Phil's repertoire. We planned it all out together in advance. My only regret is that I didn't get to see Hank's reaction in person a day later when Phil made the following phone call while I stood behind him listening. "Hi, Hank, it's Phil calling. Yeah, about that. I've decided to get some other quotes from other agents. I'm not going to sign up with you." No, you shouldn't give a discount. You'd be losing money if you did that." "No, this is just a decision I've made. No, it has nothing to do with Rocky Moose." "Well, you don't have to like it, Hank. You just have to accept it. Goodbye." And it was the greatest revenge I could have ever imagined. Through a chance meeting years later, Hank got screwed out of $20,000 in easy commissions. And the best part is, Hank absolutely knew it had everything to do with Rocky Moose.